Tonight, in lesson number 4, we're going to be looking at James chapter 2, verses 14 to 26. Authentic Christian faith. Keep in mind that one of the themes that runs throughout the book of James is authentic Christianity. The idea of putting your money where your mouth is, or practicing what you preach. We might use some of those more modern cliches. Last week we looked at authentic faith does not practice partiality. It does not practice favoritism. That's the word I'm looking for. And so in verses 14 to 26 of the same chapter, James begins by asking a question, and in this first verse here of the text, verse 14, it lays out the two sides of this question. And he begins by saying, can that faith save him? And so he lays out here two types of faith, and so we're to choose one. Which faith is a saving faith? The faith that is dead or of the devil, or the faith that is, as one writer put it, dynamic. That is, it works, it engages in action. And so, Martin Luther really struggled with James, particularly what he has to say in chapter 1 and 2 about faith and works, and what Paul said in Romans chapter 4. And he just could not seem to harmonize the two, where Paul says on one hand it is faith only, without works, particularly without the works of the law. James says, by works a man is justified, and not by faith only. And he just could not bring those two together. And I think when we are finished here tonight, you won't have that problem. You'll see how you're able to harmonize the two statements, primarily by understanding the distinction between the two types of works. Paul is talking about a certain type of works, and James is talking about another type of works. And when you're able to make that distinction, then you'll see that there is no contradiction between what Paul is saying in Romans chapter 4 and what James says, particularly in James chapter 2. Now, first of all, when you begin talking about faith, you want to just lay down some very fundamental facts, and that is that faith is a necessity, that one cannot be saved without faith. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6, without faith it is impossible to please him. Now, Hebrews chapter 11 is the great faith chapter, or one of the great faith chapters of the Bible. And he begins the treatise on faith by saying, faith is a necessity. You must have faith. He must, first of all, the person of faith must believe that God is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. And so faith is absolutely necessary. Let's look at some of these passages here. First of all, Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 8, as they're related to this idea of the necessity of faith. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7, Paul talks about walking by faith. He says, for we walk by faith and not by sight. And so the Hebrew writer, Paul, he says in Hebrews chapter 11 and Ephesians chapter 2 that faith is necessary for salvation. And not only is it necessary initially for salvation, but it is necessary ongoing in the Christian life. The Christian walk is a walk of faith. In Romans chapter 14 and verse 23, he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because he does not eat of or from faith. That is, or he does not eat from a position of faith. For whatever is not from faith is sin. And so everything that a Christian does in his life needs to be built upon or flow from a foundation of faith. So it is absolutely necessary. But faith, particularly as it is used today, is just spoken of in generic terms. And so we need to understand that there are different types of faith. And James talks about 3 different types of faith in this text. And so we want to examine those tonight. Now, by implication, or we can infer from verse 14 in James chapter 2, can that faith save him? Well, that's a rhetorical question. The answer is no, as he is going to go on to prove in the following verses. But he says, what does it profit, or what good is it, if someone says he has faith? So he says it with his mouth, he proclaims it, he affirms it, but he does not have works. Can that faith save him? And you get down to the end of this, you're going to conclude the answer must be no. That's a dead faith. For as a body without the Spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. Okay. So you can't just use faith in generic terms. When we speak of faith as Christians, we need to have in mind a specific kind of faith, a saving faith. And so he uses the illustration here. If you're going to say, a man may just make an affirmation, he may give a mental assent to God, and he can just say, I have faith. If you're going to say that faith can save him, then the following must be true. Verse 15. Another question. If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. And so this is the dead faith. What is the dead faith? The dead faith that just gives affirmation, mental assent, but does not follow it up with any type of action. If you will say, just giving affirmation, saying you have faith, if that will save a man, then it must also be true that the person who is cold and hungry will be filled and made warm if you go up to him and say, be warmed and filled. Just like that. Oh, thank you, sir, so very much. I feel so much better already. I'm just warmed by your kind thoughts toward me. And my hunger has just disappeared because you, through your goodwill, have spoken words. What silliness, what nonsense. Well, so it is if a person believes All I have to do is just make a mental assent or a verbal affirmation of faith, and that's all there is to it. What kind of faith is that? That is a dead faith. It is of no use. He says here, he begins by saying, what does it profit? Or what good is there in it? So when you look at these 4 verses here, verses 14 to 17, he begins by saying, what does it profit? Okay, then what's the answer? What does it profit? Nothing. No profit whatsoever. Later on, he's going to say, oh, vain man. Vain man. Vain basically means of no use whatsoever. And so that theme here is running through his treatise on faith and works. That a faith that is dead, a faith that is dead even though it speaks, it's vain. It is of no use whatsoever. Let's look at some of these references here. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 3. Here we go. Remembering without ceasing now he's talking about the Thessalonians here when he prays for them. This is what he remembers about them. This is what he mentions to God when he's giving thanks for the brethren in Thessalonica. He says, this is what I thank God for. Your work of faith, your labor of love, your patience of hope in the Lord. Now, all 3 of those concepts really go toward a faith that is engaged. It is a work, and it is a work of faith. It's labor. It is a work that builds from, or it flows from, a position of faith. It is motivated by what? A labor of love. And is it short-lived, or are they enduring in it? No, it's patience of hope. This is an endurance which is motivated by something that they see at the end of the road. Patience of hope. And so the brethren in Thessalonica, they had a faith that was working, a faith that was laboring, a faith that was enduring. Okay, 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5. Now the purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from a sincere faith. That's not the one I was. Let me see. That wasn't the scripture, the citation I was looking for. It must be a typo. I apologize. 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 to 9. I don't think so. I looked at that one. At least I thought I looked at it. Let me see. No. It's just a typo, I guess. I didn't give the right citation. 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 to 9 is the Christian virtues. And he says, giving all diligence, that is working very hard at it, pursuing it, add to your faith. And he goes through here with the Christian virtues. These are things that we need to be adding to our faith. And just about all of these are things that can be shown and manifest in some outward fashion. And so James says here, if you're going to on the one hand say you have faith, then you need to back it up and show that it is not a dead faith, that it's not something that is worthless. Okay, so that's the type of faith, the first type of faith, the dead faith. Second type of faith is the devil's faith, the type of faith that the devils have. Now, in the first type of faith, you have the part of man, you have man, and the only part of his person that is engaged is his intellect. He's just simply thinking and either giving a mental assent to a truism or mental and verbal affirmation to something that he says he believes. When you look at the devil's faith, the demon's faith, then you have here not only the mind, the intellect engaged, but also the will, not the will, the emotions. In the saving faith, which is dynamic, that's where the will is engaged. So we see that saving faith, kind of giving you a little, jumping ahead of myself here, but since I've already said it, I might as well lay it out. In the three types of faith, in the first type, it's only the intellect. In the second type, it's the intellect and the emotions, or we might say, well, I don't want to say really the heart, because the heart is everything. But it's the intellect and the emotions. In the third, it's the intellect, the emotions, and the will. There's action that's taking place there. The devil's faith, number 2. Beginning in verse 18. Someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Now, who would say that? Would someone say that today? Well, sure they would. Someone in doctrinal error who preaches a salvation of faith only apart from any type of obedience rendered to the Lord. Well, you're preaching works salvation. If you preach that any type of trusting obedience is necessary for salvation, then you're supposedly preaching works salvation. Well, of course, that's not true. But will someone say, well, I have faith and you have works. I'm a spiritual saved person. You're one of those carnal works salvation people. Someone might say that. Well, is it legitimate? Is that a legitimate assertion to make? James says, show me your faith without your works. I will show you my faith by my works. Quite a challenge there, isn't it? Show me your faith without your works. What is implied here? You can't do it, can you? How are you going to show someone faith apart from works? So I think what James is implying here is you can't do it. Faith involves works. So, I have my imaginary chair here, and I say, this is a good, strong chair. I built it myself, and it's a good, strong chair. It will hold me up. And so George back there says, I like that chair. I think I'd like to buy that from you. I'll give you $10 for that nice chair that you built. He says, we're both big fellas here. Are you sure it's going to hold me up? I said, yes, it'll hold me up. He says, okay, you sit in it. I said, no, I'm not going to sit in it. Now, what's George think about my belief in the strength of that chair? I don't have any, do I? He says, not only are you a fraud, you're not a very good carpenter either. No, show me your faith without your work. So I think implied here is that you can't do it. You can't show faith apart from works. And so he says, I will show you my faith by my works. This whole idea that faith and works are mutually exclusive. And that's what he's laying out here in verse 19. Someone will say, well, you can have one or the other. If you want to have faith, but you can't have works at the same time. If you want to have works, you can have works, but you can't say it's faith. They're not mutually exclusive. As a matter of fact, to have one, to have faith, you must be able to demonstrate it and show it somehow. Go through Hebrews chapter 11. That might be a pretty good exercise for us to do just here at this juncture. I want you to notice all of the verbs. All right, look in verse 4. What verb is associated with Abel's faith? Offered. Let's go down. Let's see. Verse 7, Noah. What verb is associated with that? Or verb? Prepared an ark. You see the connection there as you go down through? There are, in most cases, there are actions of some sort associated with the faith. Look at verse 8. By faith, what verb do we have there? Obeyed. He went out. By faith, Isaac blessed. Verse 20. Verse 21, Jacob blessed. Verse 24, Moses refused. Verse 24, Moses chose. Verse 25, all of these things, 30 and 31, Joshua and Rahab. So you see, works, particularly trusting obedience, what Paul calls the obedience of faith. It is faith that obeys. It is, let me back up just a second here. It is obedience that is motivated by faith, brought about by faith. So the evidence of a person's faith is their works. You go to Romans chapter 6, and where Paul talks there about baptism and its association with the resurrection and one's faith in the resurrection. What does it say about one's faith in the living Christ, the resurrected Christ, and Christ's power, or rather God's power to raise you from the dead? What does it say about your faith if a person just refuses that altogether? I'd say it's pretty weak faith. Pretty weak faith in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If it's not that, I would say at best, that's what it is. At worst, it's just stubborn obstinance. Now, let's pick up here in verse 19. I promise you, I'm not going to go to a quarter after tonight like I did last week. You believe there is one God. You do well. Even the devils believe and tremble. So if that type of faith could save, then the devils would be saved. If saving faith is absent of works, then the devils could be saved. Well, who would say that? Well, nobody. But you see here how the emotions are involved. The devils believe, but what do they do along with that? They tremble. And so their feelings are engaged. Matter of fact, I would say, and confidently so, I think I'm on pretty solid territory here to say that if your emotions are not affected, then you probably don't believe. Because how can your emotions not be affected when you truly believe? How can your feelings not be affected when you I'm talking about the message of Christ here. I mean, I believe that this podium here, and that doesn't really affect my feelings all that much, you know. But I mean the gospel message, the belief in the tender, loving affection that my wife and I have for one another. Shouldn't that affect my feelings? Well, certainly so. If I didn't believe that she loved me, wouldn't that affect how I feel? Certainly so. So it must affect one's emotions. Now, verse 20, and let's just read through verse 26. But do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Now, he's going to use two examples to show that this is so. One is Abraham, and the other is Rahab. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son upon the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? That is, faith was made complete. It was fulfilled. And verse 23, and the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. Notice what he's saying here about Abraham. He was saying, by works, faith was made what? Verse 22. Made perfect. And then he said that means made complete. It was filled out. It was completely mature. And the scripture was fulfilled. Which scripture? Genesis chapter 15. Abraham believed God, and it was accounted or credited to him for righteousness. He was called the friend of God. In Romans chapter 4, let's go and look at Romans chapter 4. We're going to start reading in verse 1. What shall we say then in Abraham our father has found according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something of which to boast, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Now this is a direct quotation from Genesis chapter 15 and verse 6. Very important to remember that. Genesis 15 and verse 6. What does it say there? Abraham believed God, it was accounted to him for righteousness. Now to him who works, the wages, that is the reward, are not counted as grace, but as debt. There are two things that we can learn for our purposes tonight. We will learn from this text in Romans 4, 1-4. Number one, what is James talking about, or to what is he referring when he says here in James chapter 2, the scripture was fulfilled that Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness. The same scripture that Paul cites, Genesis 15 and verse 6. Abraham believed God, and it was credited or accounted unto him for righteousness. Now, in Genesis chapter 15, God is making his covenant with Abraham. This is where he takes Abraham and he shows him. And he makes promises to him. And not only to him, but to the generations that are going to come after him. And God made a covenant with Abraham, and Abraham believed everything that God said. And God accounted it to him for righteousness' sake. Let's turn back to Genesis chapter 15. Now, God says, you are going to be the father of many nations. Promised them this in Genesis chapter 12. He says in chapter 15 and verse 1, I am your shield and your exceeding great reward. Abraham sees this as an opportunity to remind God, I'm supposed to be the father of many nations, but I don't have any children yet. And so he says, verse 4, that this one, that is Eliezer, shall not be your heir, but one who comes from your own body shall be your heir. So he brings in verse 5 to look at the stars. So your descendants will be like this. Abraham does not have a single child. Not a single child. Does not have, Ishmael is not born yet. Does not a single child from his own body. All he has is Eliezer, who's the steward of his house, kind of his right-hand man. And then God takes him out and says, look at the stars. Your descendants, oh, by the way, you don't have a single child yet. Your descendants are going to be that numerous. Now, if you ever get away from the city, out to where there are no lights, and you, on a clear night, look up at the sky. We did this in Smoky Mountains when you're miles away from the lights of the city. You get up on a mountain and you look up there. And it used to be said that when the ancients would look at it, it would scare them. It would just intimidate them because there were so many of them, so bright. You just look at that, and God says, your offspring is going to be like that, and you don't have a single child. It says something about Abraham when Abraham believed him. But what did God command of Abraham at this point? Hasn't commanded him to do anything. He's just made a statement and has said, you will have children like all of those stars. Genesis chapter 15. That's what Paul's talking about when he said, Abraham believed God, it was counted unto him for righteousness. Now in James chapter 2, he's talking about what took place in Genesis chapter 22. Was not by works when he offered Isaac his son upon the altar. Notice he identifies who Isaac is. And people would know who Isaac is, but he says, Isaac, his son. Now, at this point, Ishmael's already been sent away. God has said, through Isaac, your seed is going to be called. So there is no one else through whom the promise is going to be fulfilled. Remember that promise is Genesis chapter 15. Your descendants shall be like the stars of the heaven. Here's your son. God says in Genesis 22 and verse 1, your only son, Isaac. You take him to a mountain in Moriah and offer him for a burnt offering. And Abraham does it. And so you see now how this is fulfilled. His faith is made perfect. God commands him to do something and he does it. He obeys. His faith is complete. It's perfect. It's mature. It's been tested. You don't know how good something is until you test it, right? That's why George wants me to sit in the chair. Paul, sit in that chair and test it and make sure it's going to hold me. Because I know if it'll hold you, it'll hold me. So test it first. So I sit in a chair. Yes, it'll hold me. Okay. That's a good chair. So it is with faith. When it's tested, then it's perfected. You take a toothpick and you put it down in the cake to see if it's done all the way through. You have to test it. The idea of completeness here is a word that Paul used in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, that the man of God may be perfect, and most versions say thoroughly. One version, I think it's one of the older King James versions, says throughly. And I like that word because I have in my mind this idea of a cake or a loaf of bread being done all the way through. It's complete all the way through. If you open it up and look on the inside, the batter's not going to run out. It's not doughy on the inside. It's complete. And so, James is talking about a completely different event in the life of Abraham than is Paul. Not only is he talking about a different event, he's talking about two different kinds of works. Paul talks about the one who works, he reckons the reward as debt. Now, Richard calls me up and says, Paul, I just mowed my lawn and I've got all of these, I have all these grass clippings in my yard. You know, will you send Matthew over here to rake them up, you know, and put them in the garbage can, and I'll pay him a little bit of money. I'll pay him $10 to come rake up my grass clippings. And so I tell Matthew, I say, you need to go rake up Brother Lightcap's grass clippings. He's going to pay you $10. And so he rakes up the grass clippings, and Brother Lightcap pays him $10. Now, how does Matthew feel? Does he feel that Richard has just, out of the overwhelming generosity of his heart, said, hey, you're such a good boy. There, Matthew, here's a $10 bill. He's not going to think that. Why? Because of all those grass clippings in the dumpster. What does he think about that $10? I earned it. That's right. That's my reward. That's my pay. These are the types of works that Paul's talking about. These are the works of the law, where someone feels that they have merited, they have earned salvation because of what they've done. These are the types of works that Paul is talking about. They're works of merit. The types of works that James is talking about are works of faith. It's the type of work when you come upon someone who is shivering and hungry. You don't say, be ye warmed and filled. You say, I'm going to help to get you warm, and I'm going to help to fill you. And then you follow through. Give them a blanket or whatever and some food. Some warm food to heat them up from the inside out. Those are the types of works, not the works of the law like circumcision and the sacrifices and the different tithes and offerings and things like this. Completely two different types of works here James is talking about. So as we look at this supposed contradiction between Romans 4 and James chapter 2, we need to remember two things. Number one, Paul is referring to God's conversation with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. James is talking about something completely different. It's connected, but it's a completely different event in Genesis chapter 22. The second thing is, Paul is talking about works of merit, particularly the works of the law-keeping works, whereby one would do something and they would expect a reward, expect pay. They say to God, God, you owe me, instead of being thankful for the overwhelming generosity and mercy and grace of God. James is talking about works of faith. Works that proceed from a position of faith. That's what we need to understand. That's how you need to see this. When we say works of faith, they're works that proceed, they flow from a position of faith. So I think if we'll keep those two concepts in mind, number one, that Paul's talking about Genesis chapter 15, James talking about Genesis. Let me run that tape backwards a minute. Paul's talking about Genesis 15. James is talking about Genesis 22. Paul is talking about works of merit. James is talking about works of faith, or works that proceed from a position of faith. Now, then he talks about Rahab. You go back and read in the book of Joshua chapter 2 about the event of Rahab. But here, and also in Hebrews chapter 11. Here again, Rahab was not saved just by giving a verbal assent, but rather there was something that she needed to do. Here again, was it a work of merit? When the Israelites went in to destroy the city of Jericho, what were the works that Rahab did? Well, you know, she was like Xena the warrior princess, and she just whooped up on all those Israelites, and she was able to save her family and those types of works. Not at all. You know, she had a cord hanging out her window, and they stayed inside. What does that merit? It's just obedience, that's all. It's just following what God said via God's messengers, in this case the spies. And so she was justified by faith by obedience. So, if we're faced with this question, can one be saved by faith only? How do we answer that? Well, we need to understand, before we just say, you know, yes or no, we need to understand what type of faith we're talking about. Because Paul says, yes, it's faith only. But what kind of faith? If you're talking about a faith that is dynamic, is it the faith that James describes here, the faith that obeys from a position of trusting God? If you're putting all that into your definition of faith, then I suppose, yes, you could say one is saved by faith only. James is not talking when he says, you see that by works a man is justified and not by faith only. The faith that he's talking about here is the one up in verse 18, the one that just gives verbal assent. It's a faith that is distinct, separate, and apart from any position of trusting in God demonstrated in obedience. So, understanding faith in that way, we say, can one be saved by faith only? If you associate it with what James says here in James chapter 2, you'd have to answer that no. However, when Paul talks about faith only in Romans chapter 4, he's not talking about that kind of faith. He's talking about a faith that is fully engaged in reaching out to God with our whole being and taking hold on what God offers to us. It's Abraham's faith. Now, when God said something to Abraham, Abraham believed it. But when God commanded Abraham to do something, did Abraham obey it? Yes, he did. And so if you understand faith in that way, then with that understanding, we can say one is saved by faith only, understanding that the works, the trusting obedience is an integral part of that faith. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't want someone to, particularly someone on the internet say, he's preaching faith only. Well, as long as we understand that it's an obedient faith, an active, living faith, right, then in that sense, yes, it is faith only. But not in the sense that, it's just a dead faith. Okay. Well, I'm sorry, I did go a few minutes over. We'll stop there. We'll pick up in chapter 3 next week. Thanks for coming.